One evening, during what seemed like an ordinary conversation, Sarah found herself apologizing again. "I think you misunderstood me," she said gently. Her partner sighed, leaned back, and shook his head. No, Sarah, you always twist things. That's not what happened." She paused. "That's not what happened," she paused. Because she remembered it clearly, the tone, the words, the moment, and yet something in his certainty made her doubt herself. Maybe I did misunderstand. Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe I'm the problem. So, she apologized. Again, what's unsettling about moments like these isn't the argument itself, even the occurrence itself. It's the quiet shift that happens inside the mind, because two people can experience the same event and walk away with completely different realities. One becomes more certain. The other becomes less sure of their own memory. And over time, that imbalance grows. Not through force, but through subtle repeated distortion. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Gaslighting doesn't always look like manipulation. In fact, most of the time, it doesn't feel like abuse at all. There are no dramatic outbursts, no obvious lies, just small corrections, tiny denials, slight reinterpretations of events, until eventually the victim stops trusting their own perception of reality. And that's the point most people miss. Gaslighting isn't about controlling what you do. It's about controlling what you believe is true. Psychologically, gaslighting operates by destabilizing one of the most fundamental human systems, our sense of cognitive certainty. As humans, we rely on memory and perception to construct reality. But those systems are not perfect. In fact, they are surprisingly fragile. Research in cognitive psychology has repeatedly shown that memory is reconstructive, not reproductive. We don't recall events like recordings. We rebuild them every time. This makes us vulnerable. Because if someone consistently challenges your version of reality, especially someone you trust, your brain starts to adapt, not by resisting, but by adjusting. One of the most revealing psychological insights comes from studies on a memory conformity. In controlled experiments, participants were shown events and later exposed to false information about what they saw. When questioned again, a significant number of them incorporated the false details into their memory, believing them to be true, not because they were weak, but because the human brain prioritizes coherence over accuracy. We want our reality to make sense, even if that means unconsciously altering it. Gaslighting exploits this exact mechanism, but it adds something more powerful: emotional dependency. Because when the person distorting your reality is also someone you care about, your brain faces a conflict. Either they are wrong or your perception is. And choosing the first option threatens the relationship. So many people, without realizing it, choose the second. This is where gaslighting becomes deeply psychological, not just behavioral. It slowly rewires the internal dialogue. Instead of asking, "Why are they denying this?" the mind starts asking, "What's wrong with me?" Doubt becomes internalized. Confidence erodes quietly. And over time, the person doesn't need to be corrected anymore. They begin correcting themselves. Philosophically, this raises a disturbing question. If your perception of reality can be altered without your awareness, then how much of what you believe is truly yours? Human consciousness feels stable, but it's more negotiable than we like to admit. Our sense of truth isn't built in isolation. It's shaped socially, validated externally. And when that external validation becomes distorted, so does the self. This is why gaslighting doesn't just affect memory. It affects identity. Because when you can't trust your thoughts, your emotions, or your interpretation of events, you begin to lose the anchor of who you are. Not dramatically, but gradually, almost invisibly. Socially, the consequences are profound. Gaslighting doesn't just exist in relationships. It appears in families, workplaces, and even at a cultural level. In environments where people are repeatedly told, "That didn't happen, you're overreacting, you're too sensitive," something subtle occurs. People begin to silence themselves, not because they have nothing to say, but because they no longer trust that what they feel is valid. This creates a culture of quiet self-doubt, where individuals question their instincts before expressing them, where clarity is replaced by hesitation, and where those who are most certain, not necessarily most accurate, shape reality for everyone else. But perhaps the most dangerous aspect of gaslighting is this: it rarely feels like deception in the moment. It feels like confusion. And confusion doesn't trigger defense. It triggers introspection. So instead of pushing back, the victim leans inward, trying to fix something that was never broken. And this is where the final realization begins to emerge. Gaslighting doesn't succeed because people are naive. It succeeds because people are psychologically adaptive. We are wired to maintain connection, to reduce conflict, to preserve coherence in our world. Even at the cost of our own certainty, Sarah didn't lose her sense of reality in a single moment. It happened slowly, through a series of small doubts, tiny concessions, subtle apologies, until one day she noticed something unsettling. She no longer trusted her own thoughts without first checking his reaction. And that's the quiet endpoint of gaslighting. Not control, not dominance, but dependence. Because when a person begins to rely on someone else to define what is real, they don't just lose arguments, they lose autonomy. And maybe the most unsettling truth of all is this: the human mind is not designed to resist this easily. Because the same psychological mechanisms that make us capable of empathy, connection, and trust also make us vulnerable to distortion. So the question isn't simply, why do people gaslight? But rather, how often do we unknowingly surrender our perception just to maintain harmony? Because in the end, gaslighting isn't just about manipulation. It's about the fragile nature of reality itself and how easily it can be reshaped, not through force, but through doubt.